First and foremost, thank you so much for coming on this platform. I really appreciate you. This is definitely an honor.
Oh, well, that's kind. Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you
Where are
too.
you? I hope it's not too early in the morning. Where are you located?
I'm currently in Ghana. Where you at?
Oh, wow. I'm in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm a world traveler, so I'm always on the move.
Wow. Wow. So it's quite, what time is the afternoon or something?
It's 1 p.m. here.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Good. Because I forgot to ask you when I said time, I just sort of, made up a US time. Exactly. So
Yeah,
you're
yeah, that's fine though. I'm used to it, and I appreciate you taking out the time to come on here because I know you got a busy schedule for sure.
I do, but anyway, I'm happy to talk to you. So if you can hear me, then let's get started. That's great.
Right, right, definitely. So obviously, you've been doing some amazing work for quite a few years now. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Sophia Rosenfeld, and I teach at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and I teach in the history department, and I write about both historical and present day democracy, basically.
Wow, wow, that's really cool. Now I have to ask you this: when did you develop this passion for history? Were you always like a history buff, or is it something you kind of got into later in life?
And I think I was lucky because I had very good history teachers early on. And, teachers make a huge difference at every stage because they either convince you things are really exciting and interesting ways of thinking, or they convince you never want to hear another word on the subject. So I was lucky in that regard. And then over time, I just found that thinking about the past really helps you think about the present and the future in ways that are unexpected often.
True indeed, true indeed. Yeah, a lot of people take great teachers for granted, and also history. History can be very empowering. We can utilize it, even today. So it's important that or it's a good thing that someone planted that seed in you early. You know what I'm saying?
I agree. I mean, I think, we see college teachers see students late in the game, but the people who really make a difference in a way are much earlier on because they shape your whole worldview. College can be exciting because you can come to new ideas but you're already partly a formed person when you're talking about little kids and high school kids. The whole world is, a mystery of sorts, and teachers do a lot to unlock what it's about.
Definitely, a great teacher that can be life changing. Now I have to ask you, what courses do you teach?
So right now I'm just teaching one course because I'm also chair of my department, and my course is called A History of Free Speech and Censorship. And it's meant to be a way to think about the sort of speech issues of today, but put them in a deep historical perspective. So, we go all over the world thinking about different speech conditions, and we go back as far as the 16th and 17th centuries, thinking about things like, why Galileo was tried in the papal courts in the 17th century. So it's a fun course because the issues keep changing around us. Every week there are new questions. This week, for instance, there are lots of debates about, is it okay to protest while wearing a mask? And that's a really old question. And so it's interesting to explore these in a historical context and then reflect on what's happening around us now. But I also teach courses on everything from the history of truth to the age of revolutions, France and the US.
Wow, wow. Okay, okay. Now I have to ask you, is this a difficult concept for your students? I mean, I guess I'm assuming that they come from a younger generation, and it seems like, within at least the last decade, you have cancel culture, you have to watch what you say, and even me traveling to different countries, certain things you say, you can go to jail. Certain things you wear, you can go to jail. Certain things, you even express that you're interested in could get you in a lot of trouble.
You hit the nail on the head, which is that every culture regulates in different ways what you can and cannot say. Free speech is a kind of ideal, but there's no culture in which everything goes all the time, including our own. There are lots of things, even with the First Amendment, that you can't say, and in certain circumstances can't be said. So that's the kind of first point. And the second one is the thing that you just pointed to. By traveling, you notice that the standards change everywhere. And some of those are legal. Some things you go to jail for saying. If I say I'm going to blow up this building in 5 minutes, I can go to jail for saying that if I say it as I intend to do it. But there are other things you can't say because it's just conventional. It's like informal law. Lots of things in every culture are kind of taboo to say because we've just created kind of social norms that make them impossible. And you're right that they keep changing. And students today have definitely a different conception of what's okay to say or not say than I do. They change in some ways they get more permissive, and in some ways they get more restrictive. So we definitely talk about all of that. I'll tell you one interesting thing, though, about that topic in particular is that it doesn't break in the ordinary kind of right and left ways. Sometimes students who are very right-wing will end up taking the more free speech position, and sometimes students who are really left-wing and are interested in dissident voices and the voices of the people lacking power will take the very free speech position. It sort of shifts depending on what you're talking about and what circumstance. So that makes it interesting too. The students are sometimes surprised because they don't end up allying in ordinary kind of right-left or Democratic Republican norms.
Okay. Okay. Now I wanted to ask you about some of your work. You have a few books out. If you could just tell me about, what the book is about and what inspired you to write it and how long did it take? A revolution in language. If you could speak about that.
So my first book was called A Revolution in Language, and that was a long time ago now. And that really had to do with the ways in which the way we talk about revolutions changes what happens, the relationship between language and action, really, and whether if you have a better political vocabulary, you can solve your political problems. The French revolutionaries thought maybe you could. If you could agree what freedom meant, for instance, maybe there wouldn't be any more problems with political strife. In fact, we don't actually think that today. But it's an interesting question still to think about the vocabulary for politics and how revolutions happen and why they do and why they don't. But I started out thinking more about the 18th century, and as time went on, I wrote about some other topics. The last two books I wrote, one was about common sense and whether common sense, how common sense became part of our political world, the idea that there might be this thing out there that we all agree upon and that we can use it as a foundation for politics. Usually that doesn't work so well either, but you will see that people always refer to common sense gun control or common sense environmental policies. And generally, the more controversial the issue, the more likely somebody is to talk about common sense, and which is kind of ironic. And finally, my most recent book, I could tell you about the one that's coming out next year, but the most recent book came out in the middle of the Trump years, was on truth and democracy and truth. And that's probably the book that's most relevant to the current moment, in that it was really about, are we post-truth? How is truth connected to democracy? And if we want to restore their connections, what can we do in the present?
Okay. Yeah, that definitely sounds interesting. Now, can I ask you, have you ever thought about doing like a documentary based on any of your books or research?
A good question. I sometimes contribute to things like podcasts or radio shows or documentaries as a behind the scenes or as a talking head. I have not myself made any kind of documentaries. It's really not my area of expertise. I don't think I would know how to make a good documentary, but I think documentaries are very important because they reach, as do podcasts, different audiences than do books. Sometimes one goes about talking about a book to publicize the book, but sometimes it works the other way around. You write a book and it's the opening for doing all kinds of other interesting media that maybe reach more people than the original book. One good radio show can probably reach an audience that's much larger than most people who read particularly academic books.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even you see, some books that get turned into films, and almost all the time, people say the book is better. The book is better. Then people will go back and check out the book sometime.
Mm-hmm. True.
Yeah. Okay, now if you could speak a little bit more about this, you said you have a book coming up. Is that the
Yeah.
age of choice?
Right. So I have a new book coming out in this coming winter. It's coming out with Princeton University Press, and they do a very good job getting their books pretty widely out there. And I hope this book will be of interest to people beyond history. It's called The Age of Choice, but it's really about a dilemma of today. And it asks the kind of question, how do we get to the point where we think always having more choices and more opportunities for choice constitutes a kind of freedom, that freedom is kind of picking off a menu. You go to a restaurant, the more things there are on the menu, the freer you are to pick what you like. And at the same, there's a certain truth to that, that freedom comes from, say, you're traveling a lot at the moment. You have choice of places you can go. That's a certain kind of freedom for sure. You wouldn't want to not have that. But lots of people, from psychologists to economists to philosophers, have also pointed out that choice is sometimes a really limited kind of freedom. It depends on, first of all, having access, which often is a question of money and status and all kinds of other things we don't generally pick. Choice can overwhelm you. It can be hard. You look at a menu and there are 500 things on it. You think maybe I won't pick anything. If you had two options, you might figure out which one you liked best. It takes a lot of time. It can be, choice can be a kind of false freedom. If you have 5 bad medical plans to pick from, no one really wants that choice. You'd rather have just one good one that's given to you and not worry about which one you're picking, so to speak. So I'm interested in kind of the pros and cons of choice as a form of freedom. And I'm interested in how we got to a point of thinking about freedom, not as something like I'm not being dominated by somebody else or I don't live in precarious circumstances, but is this kind of weird idea of choice off menus. But we talk about freedom of choice and freedom as almost synonyms today. And I just thought nobody'd really, it was so taken for granted. We do this so much that in a way, nobody had ever thought of it as historically specific or particular to certain kinds of cultures. And anyone who's traveled, for instance, will know that the way we think about choice in the US is not really a universal idea of what it means to be free. So I decided that this needed to be explained in some way. How did this happen? Where did it happen? When? How did it get globalized? In part because it's become this kind of weird meeting point where consumer culture is all about choice, but so is human rights and democratic culture all about choice. And they've merged in a certain sense, but they didn't start out as identical things. So I think it's a pretty interesting story, and I hope people will find it at least thought-provoking.
Yeah, yeah, definitely thought provoking. I mean, I can relate myself. Sometimes we have so many movies available and channels and YouTube, and it's a struggle to decide what to watch. Sometimes I know I want to watch something, but I don't know.
Exactly. There's a famous experiment that a marketing guru did. They set up a shop with, you walk into a store and they say, would you like to try a sample of one of our jams? And there are 100 flavors. And most people look at the 100 flavors and go, no, thank you. I guess not. And they try again and they put a strawberry and a blueberry out. And most people prefer one or the other. And they'll say, oh, yeah, I'll try the blueberry. And then they are more likely to buy it because they tried something and they liked it. And there is such a thing as, I mean, people know this in a lot of settings. When you say, if you go to Netflix and there are 2,000 movies and nothing's recommended and whatever, you cannot figure out what you would like to do because we can't process that kind of variety. Whereas a kind of smaller set of options is often easier to figure out what you might want to do and relate that to some kind of personal preferences.
Yeah. Okay. Now I wanted to ask you. You have done some editing. It was like a 6 volume book series, cultural history of ideas. If you could talk about that, and also what is the difference between obviously an author, you write the book, but when you take the role of being an editor or a co-editor.
Yeah, it's interesting because editing is very different. Editing involves having a big idea in mind, but finding lots of different writers that you admire and trying to get them to speak to the big theme you have, but letting them do it their own way, in their own voice, with their own research. It's a very different project than when you're sort of a single author. It's much more collaborative, and you have to really work in a sort of team-like way. So a colleague and I, a wonderful classicist named Peter Struck, and I got asked if we would edit a giant project, which is a 6-volume history of ideas from antiquity to the present, concentrating mainly on the West, but not exclusively. And the idea was that it would be a history of ideas, not just the ideas, but the ideas in their context. So the ideas and the culture around them, the politics, the economics, and that we would come up with a set of categories of topics that you could either read about in a single volume related to one period in time, or you could trace the same topic through all the 6 volumes. So if you were interested, for instance, in ideas about the self and what it means to be a person, you could read the article in all 6 volumes, taking you from ancient Greece and the ancient Mediterranean all the way to the present. And so we had about 60 some authors. Took a lot of years because you got to get 60 some people to all do their work and get it in on time and edit it all and get it out. So it was a big undertaking, but I think it's a pretty interesting set of books. And if you're a person who's interested in the history of ideas, it's in a way a perfect entry point into lots of different topics related to how do people think about religion, and how did they think about history, and how did they think about the arts, and how did they think about human psychology, or where knowledge comes from, or any of the kind of big topics that might be a subject of what we call intellectual history, but most people would just call the history of ideas themselves.
Wow, that sounds amazing. That's really cool. Now you mentioned okay, like modern intellectual history. Is that like a journal or?
So modern intellectual history is both the name of a field and it's the name of a journal. And intellectual history is the history of ideas, whether they're political ideas or religious ideas or philosophical ideas or ideas about anything, but in their historical context. So thinking about who came up with these ideas, how did they get distributed, how did people use them, how did they change over time, all those sorts of questions. And there's also a journal called Modern Intellectual History that is a journal of articles related to those kinds of questions. For a while, I was a co-editor of that journal. It's still a wonderful journal. The editors rotate over time. And it's a place, it's really less for probably a general audience than for an academic one, though I hope it has readers more broadly. But it's a place to explore kind of cutting edge research on the history of thought. Both great intellectuals, you can read about, Karl Marx or somebody like that, and you can also read about people you've never heard of, or even the thought of people collectively, like how does a culture think about something rather than thinking always about individuals and philosophers.
Oh, okay. Now I wanted to ask you this. I was checking out your profile and it said that your books have been translated into several languages. How many languages and which ones?
You always hope for more because, one wants readers all over the world. Different projects have been translated into different languages. I'm hoping the new book on the age of choice will have an international audience. English dominates books around the world, but it's a shame because the focus on English does leave out a lot of readers. And there are even some people who maybe can know some English, but don't want to sit down and read a whole book in English. And so when a book comes out in Chinese or Korean or Turkish, for instance, or Hindi, you open up whole new possible worlds of readers. So I'm always delighted when things get translated. Some of my work has been translated into those languages, Chinese and Korean, and some into European languages. I was very happy my last book on truth came out in Spanish and Portuguese in two different Latin American editions, which I think is really great because the question, for instance, of how truth and lies and democracy are going to fit together is now a global question. It's as important in Brazil or in India as it is in the United States. So, and keeping alive publishing in all sorts of languages around the world is a really important task for the future. So I'm always thrilled with translations.
Wow, that really sounds amazing. Now I can ask you, like, what is that process like? Is that something that you kind of pursue yourself, or you recommend yourself? Like, say if the book is translated into Portuguese or Turkish, or does the publisher, get a certain amount of requests, or how does that work?
Generally, publishers themselves help with contacts because they sell the books to international markets. But sometimes it comes from the author. Some places, for instance, the cost of producing the book is too expensive and the author can waive all of their connections and say, look, it's important for me to have an edition, say in Hindi, and then I don't need anybody to make money off of this. I just would like to get it out there. And then you might have a personal contact that you can establish that through. Other times, for instance, editions of my work that come out in Asian languages, I don't have either the contacts or the ability to find a translator, that sort of thing, and that's much more the publisher's responsibility. When my book on common sense came out in French, for instance, that was quite different because that's a language I know and I can go through the translation and work with the translator, but I can't do that for Chinese, say. So there's a very different relationship depending on who the publisher is, what the subject is, and how much the author is connected to that language or place.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. That's really cool. I have to take my hat off to you. I mean, just to be able to write books in English, is one thing, but to have them translated, that's truly amazing. Let me see. Okay, now I wanted to ask you about this. I got a chance to check out one of your interviews. I think it might have been Democracy Now. I'm not sure, but you had spoke about conspiracy theories. If you could kind of touch on that a little bit, and how do you feel in terms of, I guess it's the age of information. We have the internet. We can Google everything. Do you think that something like that is fueling more conspiracy theories, or could you see people? They'll share memes and they'll share 60-minute, 60-second videos. And sometimes the information is incorrect. Sometimes it's misleading. And then sometimes you Google it and you say, oh, wow, this really did happen. This is true.
We're in a very funny place for the history of, in the history of information and conspiracy theories. In some ways, of course, the internet has been wonderful for some kinds of truth because now, for instance, information can be disseminated cheaply, globally, quickly. You don't have to be somebody who has access to writing an article in the New York Times to get your ideas out there. So there's a kind of democratizing effect where any of us can write something right now and try to make it, go viral. So in the 1990s, for instance, when the internet first really got underway, people thought, wow, this is going to be this amazing tool for countering the power of states and propaganda, and there'll be sort of an unofficial ways in which everyone will have access to the truth. But of course, what happened is that simultaneously, all kinds of untruth started to circulate as well. And also with the same rapidity, with the same global reach, and states became pretty good at sending out false information too. So there's lots of propaganda being spewed by, rogue states of different kinds too, and political parties. And now there's as much, wrong information as right information anywhere you go. And the way the internet is set up legally and economically, there isn't a vetting process. There isn't the same sort of standards for peer review or figuring out what's accurate that you might have with traditional publishing. So what do? You get just a vast sea of false information, some of it deliberately false, disinformation, some of it just mistaken misinformation. And that competes with all the truths that are out there too. And in some ways, it's great, there's heterogeneity, but in some ways it's really dangerous too, because with things like deep fakes and conspiracy theories, our political life is really threatened. I mean, if you can show a video of Kamala Harris saying anything, doing anything, and no one knows if it's true or untrue, and it affects the next election, that's a real problem. So I take pretty seriously the fact that misinformation and disinformation are really deforming politics in the US, but all over the world. People get killed, false rumors start, there's ethnic strife. Much of it started through conspiracy theories and false information on the web. And it's really hard to counter it because people, if you believe in conspiracy theory, you think any counter to it is just part of the conspiracy.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I be confused myself sometimes because I
We
know,
all
like, yeah, yeah, because I guess I was maybe in middle school, I guess in the late 90s when we started, accessing the internet. We had AOL. So we would go like to the library maybe to do like a book report or something like that. We didn't have a lot of, leisure to kind of roam the internet. And now if you just Google one thing, 1,000 things could pop up. And then like you say, someone can have someone saying something that they didn't necessarily say, or even with the music. I know they'll have art. They have maybe AI. They could take your favorite artist and make a song. Someone else can create it. They could write it, but it'll have the voice of your favorite artist.
it's incredible. I mean, the AI stuff is even worse because AI makes up sources even, and so it'll even look like something comes from somewhere, and then you go to check what the source of that is, and the source doesn't even exist. I mean, we all need to do a lot to check where our information comes from all the time. You should not believe anything that doesn't come from a source you trust. And I don't mean trust like a family member. I mean somebody that you trust to have vetted that information. Is that song you're playing related to some company that produced this where was going to stand by the fact it's real? Is the political news you're getting coming from a verified source that you think is a trustworthy source of information? Much of the stuff we see online is just kind of crap. It just comes from somebody, some random person, or sometimes even a paid person is putting out various forms of false information. And most of us have trouble telling what's real. I mean, it takes a lot of work, but do not believe the first thing that shows up, in your feed or something like that until you really are sure that it comes from a reputable place. I mean, if you think that sounds too suspicious, be suspicious, because a lot of things are not what they seem. It doesn't mean disbelieve everything, even from vetted sources. It just means check that your sources are vetted.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. So yeah, I want to thank you again. We almost 30 minutes in. It's been a great conversation. I'm still processing a lot of the information that you shared. I really appreciate all of the work that you have contributed, and I definitely look forward to the work that you have to come.
Thank you so much. Nice to chat with you.
Definitely, it's an honor, and thank you to the viewers for tuning in. So until next time.